So welcome everyone to this webinar on climate justice and equitable futures, what's missing in IPCC AR6 scenarios and how to go beyond. This webinar is organized by the Heinrich-Böll Foundation and Third World Network, and we're very happy you're all here. Thank you for your interest and for your time. As I said, we are recording this webinar, so you're welcome to stay off camera if you don't want to be recorded. And yeah, so in terms of what to expect during this 1 hour webinar, we will just have a short introduction and then introduce our two speakers and have about 30 minutes presentation from the speakers and some Q&A, some time for Q&A afterwards. So to kick off the webinar, just a few words on the background and objectives of this webinar, why we think it's important. So first, it's just important to say that I think we all know the global mitigation pathways from the IPCC. They are probably the single most cited features of IPCC reports. They always receive a lot of attention, and especially in how the IPCC reports are being picked up in the media, but also in policy discussions and discourse. And even though they're not policy prescriptive, they very strongly shape policy discourse and kind of our collective understanding and imagination of what is possible, what is feasible, what is required, what is needed. So they are very important in how they shape our understanding of climate mitigation pathways. And there's no doubt that they are important. It's super important to have those global benchmarks that we're kind of all working towards. And they will likely continue to be important in the IPCC's 7th assessment and beyond. But what is also important to note is that the global climate scenarios and also the models that they are based on, they're underpinned by a lot of social and economic assumptions. And there has been a fairly long-standing critique that many of the models and scenarios, by and large, and for a number of reasons, tend to rely on mainstream economic thinking and in many ways perpetuate an economic status quo. And that has important consequences for how most of the modeling addresses issues of equity and climate justice, or rather does not adequately address it, how the models conceptualize development in various world regions, and also the usually supposed need for economic growth, continued economic growth including in the highly industrialized parts of the world. And also very often those mainstream economic assumptions underpinning the models lead to a very heavy reliance on unproven and actually at least currently non-existing technologies like carbon capture and storage or large-scale engineered carbon removal, CDR, instead of modeling a just and comprehensive fossil fuel phase out in many of the real solutions that we all know are proven to work and to mitigate the climate crisis. So currently, the IPCC is about 1.5 years into its 7th assessment cycle, AR7. And at the upcoming meeting in Hangzhou, China, at the end of this month, some important discussions on what the 7th assessment reports and the whole cycle will look like will be taken. And from our perspective, it's very important, of course, that the IPCC remains a key source of information and a key scientific voice on the climate crisis that is unfolding. And it's important to ensure that it remains relevant for all of us on this planet, and that its climate modeling, the climate pathways and the collective futures that are being described in these pathways really foreground equity and climate justice, and that they put forward real solutions rather than heavily relying on CCS and CDR. And with that, I want to hand over to Radhika from Third World Network to say a few words and then also kindly introduce our speakers. Over to you, Radhika.
Thank you so much, Linda. So this webinar is, it's also about stressing the very important work on carbon budget and equity that both our speakers have been doing, and which TWN itself has also been championing over the years. And TWN has been working with both of them since the last 15 years or so, and they've been doing pioneering work in championing equity in the climate process, of which IPCC itself is a very significant forum. It is with pleasure that I introduce them. Professor Tejal Kanitkar is in the Energy, Environment and Climate Change program at the National Institute of Advanced Studies. She is a mechanical engineer by training with a PhD in energy science and engineering and specializes in energy, environment and climate policy studies. Her research focuses on sustainable development, energy access and security, and equitable climate solutions, particularly in the context of developing economies. She is actively involved in national and international efforts to ensure just and equitable climate action and has participated in negotiations both at the UNFCCC and IPCC. Professor T. Jayaraman is with MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, Chennai, India, where he is a senior fellow of climate change. His academic and policy engagement includes, though not restricted to, the study of the science-policy nexus in climate change, climate adaptation, including climate change and agriculture, and global and national climate policy, particularly focusing on interdisciplinary approaches where he pays particular attention to issues of climate justice and equity. He has worked with government, academia, and civil society, and has participated in negotiations at both the UNFCCC and IPCC. And with this, I hand over to both Professors Tejal and Jayaraman. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Linda and Radhika, for that introduction. And thank you to Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung and the Third World Network for this opportunity to talk about some of these issues. The point that we wish to make and which we have made in the accompanying policy brief is that in the current, in the AR6, in the scenarios and modeling that produce global modeled pathways from which the global mitigation outcomes were targets were drawn are deeply flawed in terms of equity and projecting futures that guarantee well-being for all. The IPCC AR6 Working Group 3 summary for policymakers broadly said that GHG emissions are projected to reduce, please note the words, by 43% by 2030 in global modeled pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. There was a similar statement for 2 degrees as well, and with and without overshoot for 1.5 and 2. However, the decision in COP27 in the same year that the report was released said instead that it recognizes that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade requires rapid, deep, and sustained reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions of 43% by 2030. So what we have here is a shift from what is happening in global modeled pathways to what should happen in the real world. And this transition is the crux of the problem, as we will explain as we go along. A similar decision was also provided in the GST decision at COP28 in Dubai. We note that actually the Working Group 3 summary for policymakers had this caveat. Most scenarios do not make explicit assumptions about global equity, environmental justice, or intra-regional income distribution. It also said that global emission pathways, including those based on cost-effective approaches, contain regionally differentiated assumptions and outcomes and have to be assessed with the careful recognition of these assumptions. It's a matter of regret that the IPCC outreach never prominently brought these issues also forward. In fact, at Dubai, when these very sentences were inserted into one of the iterations of the GST decision, some countries, in fact, thought this was anti-science, when in fact, it was a direct quotation from the IPCC summary for policymakers. We note also that global mitigation pathways do not descend from the sky. They are built out of regional assumptions and outcomes. Regional assumptions were not provided in the IPCC reports and in the authors, neither in the SPM or the chapters, nor were regionally differentiated outcomes provided. Much of this was buried in the database of scenarios and had to be extracted and analyzed. Just a very few points to, as background before I continue further. We will not make a distinction between pre-specified values of some variables and values of variables derived from the modeling when all these variables are used in specifying the future. Together, they describe the future, so this distinction is moot in that respect. It is also possible to have scenarios without models, but IPCC AR6 did not accept such scenarios. We'll come back to this. The number of regions vary typically between 6 or 10, but especially for considerations of equity, we need a 10 region-based scenario. So these are the ones that we have analyzed, because here developing and developed regions of the world can be distinguished. It is striking that the extent of inequality that is seen contemporarily is extended to the future in both the 1.5 and 2 degree scenarios. One would have thought that perhaps it could be argued in 2 degree scenarios, there was greater flexibility for developing countries to reach higher levels of income. Mitigation constraints were perhaps not so serious, allowing use perhaps a little more of fossil fuel. Unfortunately, it will appear, as in the case of per capita GDP, that the benefits of more availability of carbon space accrues always to the developed countries in these scenarios. With regard to primary energy consumption, we find that the 1.5 and 2 degree scenarios both perpetuate current levels of inequality. Perhaps for those of you who read the Bible, we may remember the quotation from St. Matthew, to those who have more shall be given, and to those who have not, even what little they have shall be taken away. This is absolutely, I think, fits the description of primary energy consumption in these scenarios. It also fits the description of future income. It fits the description of future consumption and so on. It certainly fits the picture of per capita fossil fuel consumption. You see that in C1, of course, all regions have less fossil fuel consumption in 2050 than in the 2 degree warming case, but the inequalities between different regions are there. And this simply shows very clearly, as I said, that the benefit of a higher carbon budget is passed on not to the developing world, but to the developed countries in these models. So these models also assume enormous levels of carbon sequestration. In fact, you can see in some models, this is in fact the carbon sequestration which has to happen, much of it from LULUCF land use. this has to happen. This is the amount that happens before we reach net zero. So we see that over here, in one model, these have to be looked at model-wise, so they vary a bit. So in one model, we find actually that uh, the the net zero, the sequestration required is of the scale of the remaining carbon budget itself for C1, which is 1.5. And in fact, if you look at the numbers, a large number of them, of the several models here, have sequestration requirements which are of the order of magnitude of the remaining carbon budget itself. In fact, remarkably, you would expect that if you had a higher warming limit and therefore a higher remaining carbon budget, you would project less carbon sequestration in from land use. But in fact, what happens in these scenarios and models is the amount of sequestration increases even more, suggesting that actually all of this all of these scenarios take away, when there is a higher carbon budget, they give a slower progress towards net zero. And in fact, predominantly the effort is to ensure that the global north has a smooth glide path, a gentle glide path to net zero. The sequestration in blue is the portion with non-Annex 1, and the red is, of course, the Annex 1. So this is quite even more surprising and speaks to the fact that these scenarios and models perpetuate inequalities. A consequence of this high level of land use through afforestation for carbon dioxide removal and also the diversion to energy crops results in fact in reversing current trends and by 2050 increasing the population at risk of hunger. None of the scenarios have reached the SDG goals of zero hunger by 2030. No scenario even projects zero hunger by 2100. The rough estimate numbers, the average numbers are here, which we have extracted from the available scenarios which have this information. And you see these numbers are large in the real world. These are in model pathways. So in the real world, this is likely to be uh, uh, higher. So you see, in fact, that also that between C1 and C3, the most severely affected are South Asia, followed by the rest of Asia, then Sub-Saharan Africa. These are absolute numbers, so that's why South Asia looks dominant in the picture. And you see they persist to 2100. And for 1.5-degree warming, the extent of people at risk of warming is higher than at 2 degrees. So the more stringent the mitigation, the way these are set up in the global model pathway, the more is the risk to food security.
So sorry, Professor Jayaraman, you have 5 minutes left. So sorry.
Yes,
Thank you.
sure. Thank you. So now the question arises first, are these scenarios representative? Regrettably, they are not. The bulk of the scenarios come from only 2 institutions. The other, some quite misleading, unfortunately, we must say that misleading representation of these results is as if there is some statistical averaging which has been done over ensemble of scenarios with even statements about the 5th to 95th percentile range of these values, but this is misleading because these scenario collections are not representative or a sample. These are simply that which got submitted. It is also true that the overwhelming presence of scenarios from experts from a largely northern institutions means that the perspectives of the global south dominate the quite likely dominate the scenarios and narratives which are built up with this. It is also our point that we make is that the IPCC AR6 scenarios do not explore the full space of potential pathways. One, of course, is the lack of attention in the literature per se, dominated by the North to questions of equity. But it is also true that the vetting criteria imposed by the IPCC assessment excluded pathways which could have been included. For instance, criteria that scenarios must come from models, must have projections to 2100, etc. So this makes other potentially useful scenarios, it invisibilizes them, and it's also a chilling effect for new scholars who wish to find new alternatives when this kind of criteria is imposed by the IPCC, known in the world as the repository of best available science. Where do these inequalities come from? And we must distinguish both from scenarios and models. There are persistently unequal projections of basic socio-economic variables to the future. They are initially introduced as baselines, but then they become the future in COP decisions and even in the IPCC outreach. To give the global north a gentle glide path to a late net zero, in these scenarios and models, squeeze food availability, energy demand, growth and development in developing countries. This is very clear from the continued deprivation of the global south, even for 2-degree warming. And mind you, it doesn't arise from adaptation or impact. Every IPCC assessment report ignores the unkept commitments of the previous period, persistent grandfathering, and even meeting the SDG 2030 targets, let alone poverty eradication and well-being for all. Meeting even these limited targets are not a constraint on scenario. The models themselves in many ways project these unequal futures. They are the foundation. Model structures and their machinery, the way it works, do not allow for distributional justice. They do not allow interregional transfers and finance flows. They are based on least cost optimization that transfers burden easily to the global south through delayed reduction in fossil fuel use in the north, while justifying land use-based mitigation in the south. Poverty eradication is never a model constraint, and it is left to post-modeling ad hoc statements or, for the major part, simply ignored. As a consequence, you will see that, so there is, with all this talk of the decade of action, you will find that the annual emissions reductions requirement for these emissions reduction, even over in the decade of action, is most substantial for the developing world, and quite, the disparity between the developed part of the world and the developing world is striking. All of this can be summarized as Tejal and I have long maintained and written about, that this is what we mean by the continued appropriation of the carbon budget, which historically is true, the appropriation of the carbon budget by the developed countries, but they persist in these scenarios and modeling efforts of AR6 even into the future. So are alternatives possible? The answer is yes. A world with reducing inequalities in income, energy, and guaranteeing overall well-being can be modeled. We do not make the confusion like has been done from AR6 to conflate modeled pathways with the real world. But yes, the modeling is possible. And I will hand over now to Tejal to carry that part of the story forward. Thank you.
Can you stop sharing?
Yeah. There you go.
Hope my screen is visible. I'll jump right into it. What Jayaraman focused on was what was missing in the IPCC scenarios. What I will focus on is the second part of the policy brief, which is how to go beyond. So what he ended with was that yes, alternative scenarios are possible. And there are two aspects here. One is, of course, the equitable distribution of the mitigation burden. And the other is modeling a sustainable future for all. We separate these questions somewhat because they are, to our mind, also separate questions. The first one, the equitable distribution of the mitigation burden, is very much something that is already part of climate policy, global climate policy, both the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and its Paris Agreement say very clearly that climate action must be on the basis of equity and CBDRRC, and which means that developed countries must take the lead. So to say that this is, to introduce equity considerations into climate models would be introducing normative criteria into what is supposed to be otherwise objective science, we think is extremely problematic. Not having equity in mitigation and distributing the mitigation burdens is as normative as including equity. So it is, of course, possible that irrespective of what the underlying assumptions are about energy consumption or income growth or the models of development that countries choose or which kinds of options, technological options or other kinds of economic options and economic instruments that countries may choose to implement. The fact that at the global level, it is possible to still distribute the mitigation burden equitably is an obvious thing. Because what we have as a global constraint is the global carbon budget, of course, with its attendant and additional assumptions about non-CO2 GHG emissions, as well as LULUCF, short-lived climate forces, which have other impacts as well, aerosols, etc. So here, what we have done is basically we took the median pathway. There's a range of pathways within each category that the IPCC AR6 had assessed. So C1 category was 1.5, as Jayaraman said, with no or limited overshoot. And the median scenarios there, say 43% GHG emissions. So that is about 45% CO2 emissions. And if you look at what they project for Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 regions in these scenarios, it is basically 43% for Annex 1 and a higher amount, 45%, slightly higher amount for non-Annex 1 countries. There is no possibility here that is explored of allowing Annex 1 parties to at least have some space for growth into the future by ensuring that Annex 1 countries don't actually have to do anything more than what they have committed in their NDCs by 2030. Of course, alternatives are possible. So you have here an alternative scenario for the 1.5 degrees median scenario, where we've ensured that the cumulative emissions till 2050 remain more or less similar, and the annual emissions in 2050 are also more or less similar, allowing for slight increase in non-Annex 1 emissions in the near term, which is only in this decade, which of course would require, to still maintain the carbon budget, a huge amount of mitigation from Annex 1 parties. And this is, of course, in keeping with historical responsibility, the fact that Annex 1 nations have appropriated a disproportionate share of the carbon budget in the past. This is another alternative. So there are possibilities of a more equitable distribution of the remaining carbon budget, given that the total carbon budget has already been disproportionately overconsumed by the Annex 1 countries. The 2 degrees Celsius median trajectory offers a little bit more flexibility. Here also, the burden is almost equally divided. The near-term burden is equally divided, more or less. But it is possible. You don't have to have as drastic an emission reduction for the Annex 1 countries, but it is still possible to allow a little more increase, at least in the near term, for non-Annex 1 countries by reducing emissions in Annex 1 countries a lot faster. And this is irrespective of how GDP grows or how energy grows or what kind of energy technologies are possible. Of course, countries can, if technology does develop extremely fast, as is projected, then it does look like a very good future for technology for mitigation, in the near term. Then Annex 1 countries would not have to grow this much. Possibly, but at least the modeling of an equitable distribution burden must be something that is explored. The other, so this is it shows us what the possibility of the pathways are. What you see here is the Annex 1 IPCC pathway and the Annex 1 alternative pathway. What Jayaraman was talking about is a smooth glide path that is provided to the Annex 1 countries. If they don't have such smooth glide path, then you actually have slightly more time and slightly more carbon space for the non-Annex 1 countries without changing the global pathway significantly. In fact, not changing it at all. The second question is modeling a sustainable future for all. Right? And I have already said this, excluding equity is as normative a choice as including equity. And there is, of course, every time we point out that there is no equity, we are told that, oh, but there are so many definitions of equity. Or sometimes we are told there are no definitions of equity. I mean, that is, of course, doing a great disservice to a whole lot of literature that may not necessarily all be climate literature, but even within the climate change community, there has been a history of papers and literature, scientific literature on the question of equity. But, it's not necessary that only one form of one understanding of equity be implemented or operationalized in the way in which modeling is done. So what we do here is basically try and look at an alternative approach. We begin with what is necessary instead of what is efficient. And efficient here is basically just cost effective. It is not really efficient. So we do not begin with cost effectiveness assumptions. And we explore more equitable pathways instead of the more cost-effective pathways. So very briefly, what we look at is we look at a development-based country classification because the capacity to be able to undertake mitigation action, the huge development deficits that are there play an important role in driving that possibility. So that capacity is determined by development levels. It is not determined by geographical location, as is in the current IPCC pathways. So what we have here is we look at 16 variables based on which we do a development classification. Then we look at sustainable development thresholds and energy conversions across regions. We look at carbon budget constraints then for different levels of warming, and consider both fair allocations and unfair allocations to compare what the outcome would be. The mitigation effort is determined here by looking at the energy GDP decoupling and the energy emissions decoupling that is required under these scenarios. So there are, of course, various ways in which you can classify regions. The first map there shows a per capita income-based classification. The second one shows historical emissions-based classification. The third map shows a k-means clustering-based classification using all 16 variables into 5 different groups. Then, of course, what we know as the Annex 1 regions more or less fall in similar groups. In fact, even if you take historical emissions till 2020, not just between 1850 and 1990, when the annexes were first formed, till 2020 also, the Annex 1, non-Annex 1 distribution remains pretty much what it was in 1990, with some minor changes. So then we look at convergence to about 75 gigajoules. We have a range that is possible. We looked at 95 gigajoules earlier. And 85 gigajoules is also possible. So we did a whole range of possibilities of energy conversion. 75 gigajoules, this is the current global average. Annex 1 countries as a whole are currently at around 189 gigajoules, and non-Annex 1 countries are at 52 gigajoules per capita consumption of primary energy. We ensure that a minimum per capita GDP threshold of 28,000 is met for all countries. And for countries where this is not possible using historical growth rates, we do assume higher growth rates. This might require transfers. Yes, this might require efforts to be able to make sure that countries that currently do not have the capacity to be able to grow are able to grow, especially given the fact that they are likely to face extremely high levels of impacts of climate change. And we assume very limited CDR. In fact, the assumptions are that it remains more or less at current levels, the amount of carbon dioxide removal. And what we get, of course, is in the near term, Annex 1 regions have much higher burden in terms of emissions, the decoupling between emissions and energy. On the other hand, so as we go ahead in the next decade, when non-Annex 1 countries become a little more, have a little more development that they achieve, a little more capacity, and non-Annex 1 countries also have decoupled already to a large level. And if they actually do this in this decade, it also makes the possibility of technology availability, more real for non-Annex 1 countries in the future. So in the next decade, the burden shifts. There is, of course, both parties have to still take action in all decades, but it looks very different. The picture of near-term action versus long-term action starts looking different. And of course, net zero years across, these are some illustrations for 5 countries that lie in each group. For Germany, which is in the group G1, the net zero years for 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius targets range from 2032 to 2054. Argentina can take a little more time, but has to go net zero earlier than India. India can take a little more time, but has to go net zero before Bangladesh, and so on and so forth. The difference between G4 and G5 is not too much. It varies across certain specific countries. So there is, of course, further work required to explore trade-offs between different global goals, levels of feasibility and things like that. But this is to just demonstrate that these scenarios are possible. It is at least possible to attempt to achieve equity and climate compatibility in the models. Whether or not it happens in the real world is a different question. And the question of feasibility is always very one-sidedly applied to, when arguments are made about including equity. But whether a world which faces rising amounts of a rising risk of hunger, with large parts of the world facing energy poverty, facing income poverty, facing drudgery and deprivation of a very high amount, whether is that kind of a world feasible at all, is a question that is left unanswered. So very briefly to end with, I will talk about the way forward for AR7. And here we sort of distribute it into three particular categories. One is the types of scenarios that we would that should be assessed and be part of the assessment of the AR7. The second is the kind of assessment of scenarios that must be done. And the third is the use and communication of scenarios. So in terms of types of scenarios, there must be serious and conscious efforts to foreground the concerns and perspectives of the Global South. And this has to go beyond simply just token representation of Global South authors in IPCC reports. What people have been saying, what governments of the Global South have been saying, what academics and civil society of the Global South have been saying must be seriously considered in the way in which scientists do their work sitting in their labs. And this, if you can't tell a region which aspires to be at least middle income by the next decade that to protect the world from climate change, it has to remain in poverty in perpetuity. There must be a broad range, a broad exploration of equitable scenarios for the future. And this must be, of course, equity in sharing the burden of mitigation must be explored, and also the development, variables that are linked to other developmental aspects, such as energy access, well-being, etc., must also be explored. And the range of socioeconomic futures that are actually explored must be much, much wider. What we see as the underlying socioeconomic assumptions that were used in AR6 is a very, very narrow view of the future. There is, of course, and you see this across the report, there is an extremely optimistic view of the future when it comes to transformational change in technology, sometimes fantastically so. However, there is no such optimism when it comes to economics. Most of the economics in these models is business as usual economics. Now, whether or not such kinds of technology transformation, technology that is meant for the people, whether it is going to be possible under business as usual economics is itself a question that those who say that these results must, constitute robust science. These are the questions that must be answered. The other thing is, of course, the assessment of the scenarios. We have to seriously explore the separation of scenarios and models. All scenarios need not come from the IIMs. There can be other analytical models, for example, that provide scenarios for the future. You can have conceptual models, you can have a whole range of models. The fact that only optimization constitutes modeling is a very narrow view of modeling itself. The other is this arbitrary vetting criteria that was imposed in AR6 basically invisibilizes, as Jayaraman said, certain literature. So you have to have a representation of the full range of literature. Perhaps explore scenario classification rather than providing median values, where those median values themselves they're not a scientifically valid way of assessing something that is not a statistical sample. The scenarios do not constitute a statistical sample. So what does a median mean is a question. So you have a cutoff of 5th to 95th percentile for something that is not a sample. And something like this is it must definitely be avoided as we go into AR7. And the last is the use and communication of scenarios. The fact that scenarios are a tool for exploring a wide range of possibilities for the future. They should not play a performative role. They should be used as descriptive tools that will tell you something about, certain aspects of the future. All the underlying assumptions, including those related to regional distribution, must be clearly communicated. There has to be a transparent communication of it. What we had in the AR6, where none of the regional assumptions were part of the IPCC report, the full IPCC report, not just the SPM. This should not be something that is repeated in the AR7. And all the qualifiers and caveats are to be stated clearly. They should be upfront. They should not simply be footnoted in some parts of the full IPCC report, but they should every time those results are used and communicated, those caveats and qualifiers must also be communicated. This is the hallmark of what is good science. Science does always acknowledge its own limitations and uncertainties. And if IPCC is to remain credible, then it must also do this when it goes forward. So I will stop here and close with thanking the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung as well as the Third World Network for all their support. And Akhil and Ankita are our collaborators, colleagues, and students who we did the original scientific work with. So thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much to both of you for this great presentation. Now's the time to ask questions and get responses from our two speakers. We'll start with the questions that have already been posted in the chat. Maybe we'll start with a question on, which is basically a clarification question. Why, when you set out the 1.5, 1.7, and 2 degrees scenarios, do you use 50% for 1.5 and 1.7 and not 67%? Maybe you can comment on that in the context of, climate sensitivity and likelihoods. Maybe just that one first.
Should I do that?
Yeah. Why don't you take that?
Yeah. So actually, we do take into consideration the model itself can takes into consideration the whole range, 67% from 1.5 to 50% 2 degrees Celsius. So that entire range is captured. But here, sort of, I took some just some parts of those scenarios because otherwise it's just too much, too many numbers to put out. The question is, of course, also that with much more stringent mitigation targets, you actually have what one calls mathematical infeasibility for most countries. So you can't find a solution given a certain set of constraints. Only if you weaken those constraints a little bit, and you have to see. So that's one area of exploration. So to what extent do you have to weaken what constraints and on which set of countries to be able to get a solution for, let's say, something like 1.5 degrees Celsius, 50% probability, given the fact that the carbon budget is so very limited. And this is one of the reasons, I mean, this happens, of course, in the results that we have shown right now, because we do not assume high levels of CDR. If we assume, of course, that 500 gigatons is the total carbon budget, and you have another 500 gigatons of magically available carbon dioxide through CDR, that may or may not happen, then, of course, we have more room to play with. We don't assume this, of course, but there is a bit of a limitation there. If we sort of change that constraint a little bit, maybe we have a broader range of possibilities.
Thank you. Another question in the chat was to hear your reflections on the use of scenarios by other actors, such as the SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative, who are using IPCC C1 scenarios to identify net zero pathways for corporate action. So there's been a bit of a discussion in the chat already, but if you both can comment on that.
I'll just make a comment, and I'm sure Tejal will want to comment, because this is one of those fun discussions you can have. So I think our colleagues have already pointed out to some aspects of this. But I think more seriously, this whole the problem is, how should I put it? The incoherence of individual net zero targets and the need to exercise care. So if you have a territorial jurisdiction, then within that territory, whatever the circumstances under which you have to function, then you have to contribute to emissions reductions within that jurisdiction. Now, of course, there is a question with multinationals. And I think the UNFCCC is very clear where it says that you can, the developed countries should take the lead. So I think this translates to, if you wanted an ethical guideline or equity guideline, that multinationals operating in other parts of the world, especially in the global south, outside their home jurisdictions, must be equal, must come up with the foremost technology for mitigation, irrespective of the burdens which are required by the host country. So I think they can have this thing, but to say that we will do net zero, and all of this is then based on this thing about scope 2 and scope 3 emissions also being included. And so, if you are a producer of, I don't know, you sell tractors, then you require the supply chain to that's what ends up with these discussions about food systems, etc., where you have multinationals on the one hand and the small farmer on the other, and everybody is considered part of some system. So I think one has to be careful, and basically I don't find these coherent. Whether they then use C1 scenarios or C2 scenarios or C3 scenarios seems to me a little moot. I mean, this would be my take on it. If Tejal wants to step in.
No, I think you've said it all. It is, of course, what these scenarios, these net zero pathways for corporates mean itself is a question. I mean, there are, of course, cases of oil and gas companies saying that we will go net zero by so-and-so, or 50% reduction, 60% reduction by so-and-so time. And then there is a little bit of an asterisk there, and it's clarified that it is operational emissions that they will try and reduce, which means that the emissions involved in extracting oil and gas, they will try and reduce, but the actual combustion of oil and gas will still go on. So those emissions, they are not responsible for. So, so we have all kinds of things floating around. So this, and unfortunately, this focus on net zero, driven by, of course, developed countries to a certain extent, but endorsed by the IPCC in this way at the expense of, so you don't talk about the carbon budget because that's an inconvenient thing to talk about. Let's talk about something that is far more nebulous, something like net zero. And this is, of course, then becomes easy to game.
Thank you. Yeah, David, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for the really interesting inputs. I really enjoyed listening to it. I have one question. The over-reliance on CCS was mentioned a couple of times, and I think that's reflected in the policy arena as well. But there was one outcome of the UAE consensus, which was the importance of transitioning to sustainable lifestyles and sustainable patterns of consumption and production. Which was quite interesting because it's the first time that sort of this concept of a post-growth society, or even any consumption patterns of people has been questioned, really, in an outcome of climate change negotiations. And the concept of sufficiency made it into the AR6, I believe, in the summary for policymakers, which was a sort of a hint in that direction as well. But I'm just wondering whether you think that IPCC will include just that kind of concept in its modeling as a sort of future projections and future outcomes, and whether this outcome of Dubai might have an impact on that. Thank you very much.
So, Tejal, you must let me say my 2 cents worth, and then you can do all the technical stuff around it on which you are the expert. So, I really think that in India, it's quite amazing that as a country, we don't have any climate deniers. I would love to have a couple around in my country as well, so that they can ask a few inconvenient questions once in a while. Everybody is for competitively raising to net zero faster. But we do talk about, and we do realize that sustainable production and consumption is a very important aspect of that. But extraordinarily, when we take the slogan out into the real world, everybody turns around and says, great, I think let us see how India can cut its consumption. And that's absolutely, I think, off the wall, because the levels of consumption, I think Jason Hickel has a excellent couple of papers where he looks at the global inequalities between North and South in production and consumption. So yes, sustainable production and consumption is required, but unfortunately, to distinguish and differentiate where the burden of sustainability first lies is something which is very hard even in the UNFCCC to get through. And that is why I am not a fan of these statements. We are promoters. India and all developing countries have some version of this. Bolivia has Mother Earth, China has ecological civilization. So everybody picks up this theme. But then it comes out into the world and it is about how the global south as the future consumers, potentially future demand, will be the ones to bear the burden of this reduction of production and consumption. So as for the principle of sufficientarianism, I think it is pessimism. It is a strange kind of pessimism in technology. We are extraordinarily optimistic in how we can reduce emissions, but we are extraordinarily pessimistic in how we can maintain demand or provide well-being for all while reducing emissions. So I think we have to be careful, and sufficientarianism as a philosophy, as a philosophical position, is not something that I find myself sympathetic to. Undoubtedly, there are groups which will try to include it in modeling, but I doubt whether it is going to be the major thread, because especially in the global south, because our concerns, and I really specifically talk of South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa in this regard. I'll stop here. Over to you, Tejal.
Yeah, no, just to sort of take the question of modeling, it is already there. We already have what are called low demand scenarios in the models. But unfortunately, they do exactly what Jayaraman said. While the principle itself, we think is, of course, important, it is unequally applied to those who have nothing. So, it is like telling those who are starving to go on a diet. And if that is the interpretation of sufficiency, of low demand, or of, what is it? There's some other word which is not coming to me right now. But if that is the definition, then it becomes problematic. Of course, if you're talking about high consumption economies, profligate consumption in high consumption economies, where economies are structured itself to encourage high consumption, right? And we talked about this earlier about large amounts of private car ownership. I mean, car ownership in Europe, large parts of Europe, in the United States, is over 800 cars per 1,000 people, whereas in India it is 25 cars per 1,000 people. And that's the degree of difference that we are talking about. So when we talk about sufficiency, where is it applied and in what way is it applied? Of course, there are questions of how is it that emerging economies avoid emissions going into the future. And that is a large track of research that is already going on also in developing economies. It's already very much a part of the IPCC AR6, and I have no doubt that it will be part of AR7 as well, both in the models and in the non-modeling literature. I think if we if the AR7 mainstreams the equity equity discussion, then of course how these principles of sufficiency, how the principles of low demand are equitably applied will become important to understand, and they will become, then we can have a reasonable discussion. Currently, they simply ask the poor to go on a diet. That is what they do.
Thank you both. And just mindful of the time, perhaps we just pick one last question from the chat, which was on the role of finance in helping achieve equity in mitigation pathways, as well as equity in the territorial emission space. And perhaps just the final comment that you might want to comment on. Speaking of equity, it may well be that in the real world, there's no longer a 1.5 or even 2-degree solution in which we do not mitigate the emissions of the rich, regardless of where they live. If you want to, say a few final words and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, let me go, then I can give Jayaraman the last word. This time.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, on finance, of course, it plays an important role. There is very little fiscal space in developing countries to be able to undertake climate action. Even in terms of where essential adaptation action is necessary, it is difficult for countries to do so. And there is no doubt that finance is important. We must, however, be careful not to say that, okay, large amounts of mitigation are possible in developing countries, as long as the money for that mitigation comes from developed countries. Eventually, you can't burn the money and cook your food on it. No? You still need energy. So, the idea that developed countries must take the lead in mitigation, there has to be some kind of space available for developing countries to build essential infrastructure. We need schools, we need hospitals, we need roads, people need jobs, and we need food. So, those kinds of requirements have to be met, and they cannot all be met at this current juncture by alternative energy alone. You can build a building which eventually uses much less energy, but to build that building, you need materials, you need certain kinds of resources. And that must be understood. So all the questions are not going to be solved by finance alone, although finance is extremely critical in being able to achieve an equitable solution to the problem. In terms of whether there is no longer, in the real world, there is no longer a 1.5 degrees Celsius. To the 1.5 degrees Celsius, yes, I mean, this was not something that was, this was not unknown, even when the Paris Agreement was agreed to. There were scientists at that point of time who had said that 1.5 degrees Celsius is already in the rear view mirror. So then, of course, there was the 1.5 degrees Celsius special report of the IPCC, which does not say that 1.5 degrees Celsius is not possible. It says that, yes, 1.5 degrees Celsius is possible, but for that you need radical and transformational change. And the only radical and transformational change you see is in the kind of technologies that they deploy. There is no other radical or transformational change in economic or social structures and inequalities across the world. That is where the problem lies. I won't go so far as to say 2 degrees Celsius is also out of reach. I'm not as pessimistic as that yet. So I'll stop here and I'll hand over to Jayaraman.
Thank you, Tejal. I think there is a second part to Tom's question in the chat, and that is whether 1.5 implies you have to think of the emissions of the rich everywhere. Now, I think that unfortunately, Chancel and Piketty, not Piketty, Chancel, I think, in an earlier work, had, if you take the top 10% of emitters, what proportion of emissions come from them, etc. He also used to have analysis of how different regions contribute to that 10%. And so that contribution is absolutely minor. And if you look at, say, you take India, where I know the numbers quite well, and if you look at the cumulative emissions of India, they are less than 3%. And that includes the richest people we have all put together. So I think there is a limit to which you can carry the argument of personal consumption, because in the way we do it, then where industrial emissions are allocated, after all, we live under capitalism and not socialism. And so, you know, if there are emissions of the rich, they also contribute to what constitutes the economy. So I think that argument, I think, I don't think is technically correct, and it shows the limit of the consumption-based idea. As for finance, I cannot, underline how much Tejal and I have tried to emphasize that money alone is not enough. So you need, that is why the UNFCCC correctly talks of technology transfer. It talks of capacity building, not just holding skill workshops or finding new jobs for people who are taken out of coal production. But it speaks to the ability to absorb technology, to go through the learning curve for technologies, and it also requires the money necessary to do it. So I think that is what the time that you require is what then becomes the carbon space that we are talking about, you know. So the transition period, it cannot happen overnight. And this is, I think, very crucial. Money alone is not the solution. I just want to end by saying that we hope that I see a number of friends in the audience or from organizations and civil society groups that we have worked with or engaged with in the past. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of producing work on scenarios, pathways, and imagining futures which are equitable. I think we have this equity discussion is on the table at the IPCC. That is very good. And I think I would not be negative. It would be unfair if I do not also point to colleagues from across the world, both from the North and South, who have engaged with us on this question in fairness. But I think what is lacking is a sufficient body of work. Just as the IPCC gave a call for scenarios for exploring the space of 1.5 degree limited warming, I think we need to give a call for imagining futures that are sustainable and equitable, and to bring to it the same degree of scientific rigor, robust analysis and accuracy that we have brought to other questions. And I think civil society can play a great role in facilitating and promoting this process. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. Yeah, we went a little over time, so I suggest we wrap up here. Thank you all so much for staying on and engaging and your interest. And yeah, have a good rest of your days, and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.